segment.
Let's, because coming up at 4:30, 4 o'clock this afternoon, we love Pete Range and Say Yes to Life. Immediately following is this week's Bishop's Corner.
Yeah.
And one of the questions that you will hear this afternoon is this one. This one is from David in Toledo.
Thanks, David, for writing.
Dear Bishop Thomas, I am trying to sort out when I received the sacraments as a young kid. I know now that kids receive the sacrament of reconciliation in second grade a couple of months before their first communion. Growing up in the Diocese of Columbus back in the early to mid-'80s, I received my first communion in second grade and my first reconciliation in the fourth grade. Why was my timeline so different from the one kids go through today? Did something change, or was there something wrong about when these sacraments were offered to me?
Thank you, David, so much for the thoughtful question. And I have to share with you now, it wasn't just you. It wasn't just the Diocese of Columbus. It was a number of dioceses all around the United States. But I can share with you, and you didn't reveal your age, David, but I can tell you when I received First Holy Communion, it was way back in the 60s, and I received First Penance and then First Holy Communion. So in a nutshell, I would humbly direct you, go to the sources, David. That's what I always say. The General Catechetical Directory issued by this then Sacred Congregation for the Clergy in, are you ready for the date? 1971. So the traditional sequence of receiving First Penance before First Communion was reaffirmed in their norms. David, 1971. So, quote, taking everything into account, it would seem that one could not, in principle, abrogate a common and general practice, except with the consent of the Holy See. Having consulted Episcopal conferences, the Holy See believes that it is proper to continue the Church's custom of placing First Confession before First Communion. So, this has been referred to, David, I can tell you, by pastors as an experiment, a sacramental pastoral experiment. And unfortunately, they postponed First Penance until after First Communion. And that was an experiment going on all around the country and around the world. But then they were re-examined. And of course, it was the reality that in 1973, notice the time frame, the very same congregation and the then Congregation for the Discipline of the Sacraments, with the approval of now Saint Paul VI, declared these experiments should cease and everyone should conform to the decree. So when you asked, I think it's very important, though, to note this was not following the direction of the Church. Unfortunately, they were not doing what the Church asked, and the sacraments administered this in this way, though, it didn't make the sacraments invalid. I think that's important to say, David. So did you receive the sacraments validly? Of course you did. Licitly, I'm sure, but they were simply in the wrong order. That's not your fault. So I think it's important to say it was simply erroneous pastoral practice. Thank you.
Love that, and you're going to hear that, and probably 4 others this afternoon at 4:30 on the Bishop's Corner.